That is, by considering the text in terms of a wahid and a ma'aniyya tamam, so unity and complete meaning, beyond the meaning of the word or sentence. Complete meaning can, in other words, only be grasped through interpretation. For Shabbastari, the text does not become meaningful through an a posteriori rational fusion with its own historical circumstance. Its comprehensive truth is neither completely latent within it nor solely projected outside of it, meaning historical circumstance. Meaning only emerges as a result of the text's dialogic encounter with a reader situated in a historically conditioned present and dependent on the use of language. Language, in Shabbastari's view, is an element that possesses its own degree of dialogic agency and conditioning power. Shabbastari, so in Qira'at Nabawiyya Jahan, he also writes that hermeneutics revolves around, quote, the relationship between perception, language, and truth, around the role of language in the fashioning of truth and the respective acknowledgement of the pragmatic structures of language. That is, recognizing speaking as a speech act. And if you're familiar with literary theory, speech act is very popular. And the various forms of speech acts used to make appeals, evaluations, or simply the normative functions of language. Language as a channel of communication and a vehicle for influencing society. While he does affirm the fact that authors do possess a high degree of reasoned intentionality in composing their work, the passage of time has a specifically historical and linguistic quality that defies a neatly conceived transcendent rationality. It affects not only the reception of multiple rational truths from within a text, but the content of such a truth as well. And that's a point made by prominent scholar of modern Iranian political thought, Ashk Dalan, who works in Sweden. This kind of truth can perhaps be described as a single husk, and this is me, whose kernels are simultaneously multifarious and multiplying. Indeed, Shabbastari makes an explicit comparison of his vision for the hermeneutical sciences to an act of literary translation. Quote, the idea that is embedded in the text must be translated into the language of the contemporary horizon through an act that assumes the character of translation. Interpretation becomes necessary when the horizon of the interpreter and that of the author diverge, and then ambiguity appears. As long as ambiguity does not appear, there is no need for interpretation. If we want to understand correctly what the text says, then we have to settle our language as a language for textual understanding, where our experiences become situated to understand the text. So these are complex ideas, and it's far beyond the scope of this paper or this presentation to evaluate their merits philosophically. I mean, and again, I don't endorse Shabbastari. I don't endorse anyone. But even this brief presentation of Shabbastari's views on hermeneutics can illustrate the sharp contrast between the rationalist typology of early modernism developed in the pre-Islamist Indian subcontinent and the post-Islamic revolutionary framework of contemporary Iran. In the coming section, the paper will explore how those hermeneutical principles developed outside of Islam are nevertheless essential for their subsequent interpretive moves related to Scripture. Moves that Shabbastari and Rahman want to ensure Islam's survival and flourishing. In both divine revelation and the Prophet and major themes of the Quran, Fazl Rahman articulates a nexus between the character of the Prophet, the spirit of revelation, and the nature of the divine command which ultimately emerges in connection with the revealed text. In both works, Rahman maintains a fairly conventional position concerning the integrity of Muhammad's prophecy as unique and related to his perfected moral status. Yet Rahman's focus on the spirit of revelation and its connection with Muhammad's evaluation of the ideal and the historically contingent, and its contention with Muhammad. The evaluation of what is considered ideal and what is considered, on the other hand, historically contingent, especially in major themes of the Quran, constitute Rahman's real hermeneutic innovation. It points at the methodological critique made explicit in Islam and modernity, one that occurs squarely within a discursive tradition regarding the application of hermeneutics to Scripture. Rahman sees the modern Muslim philosopher as an especially prescient and authoritative member of a community linked epistemically to the Prophet's mode of cognizing the divine. So the Prophet and the philosopher, they're in the same space. One is simply more developed, has a more developed aql, or closer to a body aql than the other. Perhaps even more importantly, Rahman sees the Prophet as producing a unified scriptural text into a broader social milieu as both a response to political exigency and as an authentic moral exhortation meant to last for posterity. So he's reacting to both history and a sense that this rational truth needs to be preserved. As noted earlier, it is this position which led to his denaturalization from Pakistan in the 1960s. In Divine Revelation, the Prophet, published in the Pakistani Journal of Islamic Studies in 1978, Rahman outlines his two main positions regarding Muhammad's prophecy. He describes the prophetic valence as simultaneously emanating from God and within the Prophet's mind. So we've seen across this program how Aql both comes from God and is internally a capacity to comprehend the divine. Quote, in creative knowledge, and particularly in revelation, the ideas and words are born into the mind of the prophet. Since they are new ideas and discoveries, their source cannot lie in the mind of the prophet, but must be traced and referred to a source beyond. However, since the ideas and words are born in the mind of the prophet as its integral process, the words are, in an ordinary sense, also referred to the agent's mind itself as well. Thus, the prophet is empowered to both mediate and create the product of revelation, namely the Quranic text whose ultimate revelatory telos is religious and moral. Indeed, Muslims will ultimately, quote, appropriate the Quran according to the manner in which it is produced. Rahman also maintains here that the Quranic revelation is, quote, entirely sui generis and separate from any form of creative thinking or creative art, precisely due to the fact that its artistic effect was meant to inculcate certain behavior. The reiteration of this position, besides acting as a general injunction against idolatry, resists efforts to turn the spiritual message of the Quran into either subjective aesthetic, detached from authoritative collective guidance in the moral realm, or, on the other hand, as a rhetorically seductive political manifesto relating solely to the era of its composition. The Quran successfully establishes the epistemic connection between the foundational past and the interpretive present due to its status as applied philosophy, or rather as a pre-interpretive ethics. In major themes of the Quran, Rahman is able to deepen these arguments and begin to expand their implications beyond the mere personhood of Muhammad and towards present practice. The beginning of his analysis of prophecy and revelation insists on those elements' intimate relationship to an interpretive community in the present. Prophecy and revelation are not fixed events bound by the historicity of the text. Even though Muhammad's degree of prophetic perspicacity will never be reached again, Rahman rejects the notion that, as he puts it, no further revelations are needed following the spiritual apex of Muhammad. So he doesn't say that revelation happened with Muhammad, the supreme revelation, but the philosophic mind can intuit things in the present in a fashion that resembles revelation. It's a similar epistemology. Moral lacuna have not evaporated from the Islamic, bad morals have not evaporated from the Islamic community since the time of Muhammad, and the epistemic sphere once assumed by the Prophet is now occupied by the philosopher and his disciples. Again, from that the essay about the divine prophet, man's moral maturity is conditional upon his constantly seeking guidance from the divine books, especially the Quran, and that man has not become mature in the sense that he can dispense with divine guidance. It must be held that an adequate understanding does not depend anymore on chosen personalities, but has instead become a collective function. So philosophy is not merely the province of the elite, but philosophical rationality is adopted by the state and spread by its educational system, which he was keen on influencing. I'm going to skip down. I'm going to skip some more parts about Rahman. So I'm going to go to Shabbastari. Shabastari's influential and controversial essay, The Prophetic Reading of the World, makes similar claims regarding the prophetic authorship of the Quranic text and the nature of religious understanding. And I'm not going to say everything here. Like Rahman, Shabastari believes that the epistemic understanding, which he terms fahm, is non-religious in nature. And just a little water. Thank you. And that the Quran is the direct product of the Prophet. Yet upon further examination, Shabastari's highly dialogic and contextualized conception of hermeneutics provides a degree of nuance and rigorous flexibility absent in Rahman's prophetic account. Indeed, their respective radicalities are in fact deeply dichotomous. While Rahman's philosophical conception of a unified epistemic sphere expands the providence of revelation to include a very prescient potential for human understanding of divine intent, Shabastari contracts human understanding of divinity and places the potential for differentiated modes of human understanding into language. So God is becoming more transcendent in Shabastari. Sort of transcendent immanence. Transcendent, but present and immanent in language. Perhaps paradoxically, Shabastari's methodology expands the sphere of religious knowledge while contracting both knowledge of the divine and the authority of those who dare to claim political authority on her basis. Shabastari emphasizes the rather radical notion that divine revelation basically consisted of a realization on behalf of the Prophet that the passionate and momentous dialogue he was conducting was in fact deeply inspired. Revelation was, quote, the sign of a dialogue in which he himself functioned as the speaker, though he did not want to understand things in this way as if he had decided himself for this. No, he was carried by the experience of being chosen by God and elevated to be his messenger. And all of this was due to a bit of transcendental linguistic help. Prophetic language is thus a man-made language produced by the dialogic encounter of an extraordinary man with the absolute transcendence of God. A conversation with the fullness of his absence, if you will. His communication of this experience with the world around him through language is also considered a hermeneutic act, specifically because the faithful were brought into dialogic content with the essential humanness of a man who, quote, would never have peace and calmness, which he quotes from, I think, a hadith. Though this revelation was a one-time event, and despite the fact that the Quranic text needs to be interpreted as a unity, Shabastari does maintain that Scripture is, quote, incomplete in its manifestations of God. Shabastari is adamant that his conception of fa allows non-Muslims to also take part in understanding the Quran. He does not wish to prove, as Ayatollah Montazeri has attempted, that human rights are intrinsic to Islam and can be derived out of the Quran through ex posteriori prioritization of certain values over others, such as the idea of non-compulsion within the Quran that has influenced discourses of human rights that are considered, well, Islam originally had human rights, that kind of talk. He notes that attempting a hermeneutic along those lines can only result in, quote, tyranny of either a religious or non-religious nature. His dialogic hermeneutics, however, do allow for a current of influential and beneficial thoughts such as the Western discourse of human rights to eventually become fused into the substrate of the Islamic tradition. It should do so in the same way that Islam itself developed its respective religious sciences through cross-cultural encounter and selective appropriation in the formative period of Islam. So he wants to say the dynamic of the formative period of Islam, it's not only contained in that period, but it continues. It's that dynamic, and we should try and emulate. And this is highly, I work in contemporary Western political philosophy as well, and it's highly reminiscent of Hannah Arendt's critique of revolution, where she says, when discussing the United States, that the United States has done nothing to preserve the spirit of revolution, but merely concretizes a historical moment within institutions, and institutions are supposed to do the work. She wanted to revive all sorts of small town public forums that were at the time of the revolution. That was her idea. So incorporating human rights so positivized Islamic's law in the modern sense is, quote, one that considers law as a positive organization and constitution, and in reality departs from the traditional juristic method of legal inference. By attempting to develop a generalized concept of social change from the Quran and positivize it in the form of law, the jurisprudence of Iran finds it's difficult to bring together tradition and modernity, and he's trying to find a way out of these binds. Something that has put him under much criticism here. Again, I don't endorse any of this. It has rendered its own revolutionary spirit. I want to skip this. In short, he wants to have greater dialogic fluidity between Islam and the West. He wants to have a form of Islamic law that is more dynamic, and that when you positivize Islamic law, there's a danger in it that you're not able to capture the revolutionary spirit